MacLean, who is the author of the book Democracy in Chains. Nancy is the William H. Chafee Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke University. And as she'll maybe talk about a little bit at the beginning of our conversation here, she's published this really interesting, I guess what I would call public history, or the history of done by a public intellectual of James Buchanan and his theories of political economy, and sort of how they've influenced the radical right, including such people as the Koch brothers. And before turning over to Nancy, I would just say one of the things that is really interesting about the book, and I think for AAUP members, especially in places like Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio, the book really lays out some of what I think we saw happen in those states in 2010 around midterm elections, and sort of the implementation of the agenda that Nancy identifies in the book. So with that, I will turn it over to Nancy. We have some questions that were sent in by members. We'll go ahead and ask a few of those and let Nancy take it from there. So welcome,
hello,
Nancy.
It's great to be with you. I'm really excited about the work that the AAUP is doing. You've been just amazing in defending people from the attacks that are coming from the right too. So I was really, really looking forward to this conversation.
And we're thrilled to have you. Obviously, our members who are at our annual meeting got to hear you speak there, but it's great to have you back. So one of the things that really struck me and some of our readers when they read the book was that the right has come up with a really compelling narrative. And it's one that, in some ways it misleads people, but it's very compelling. People buy into it. And one of our members asked us if you had any thoughts on, is there a counter myth or a counter narrative that we should be telling that's equally compelling? And especially I think for faculty and folks in higher ed at this moment of, increased attacks on higher education and increased anti-intellectualism, how do we tell our story in a way that grabs people?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question. I've been asked a lot that when I've been out on the speaking trail, people saying, the right is so good at message discipline and we're sort of cacophonous, right? We don't really focus that well. And I think that that's a big challenge, and it's not like I have a silver bullet for it, but I think that part of it is just reclaiming the story of what we have done together as a people. I also teach the history of social movements, and I did actually try to build in a lot of that counter narrative into the book so people could see what the Koch network is fighting against, on the progressive side. So I think that's important. I think also for your members in states that are dominated by this radicalized Republican Party, going back to some state history could be very useful. For example, I'm here in North Carolina, that was one of the poorest states, through the 19th century and certainly at the opening of the 20th century. And it built itself up by smart public investments in education, in roads. I mean, there was issues of segregation and Jim Crow and all of that, and I don't mean to minimize that, but I think people need to remember that most of the things that we value and depend on today as Americans have involved public investment in the democratic process. So we need to reclaim that narrative, and I think the value of public higher education at all levels is part of that.
Thank you. I mean, I really noticed that in some states like Wisconsin, where there really is a strong state history around public higher education and the Wisconsin idea, and just watching that get dismantled. And it seems like the momentum that Tony Evers has had there in the Democratic, as a Democratic candidate for governor, is somewhat built on reclaiming education as a public good and as a state good, and something people should be proud of.
Yeah, and I think that's true actually around the country, and we could maybe be pointing to those cases more. The Red for Ed movement, for example, in states like North Carolina, West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona. I was out in Arizona earlier this month, and it's amazing what they've done there. The teachers' mobilization has led to many K through 12 teachers running for office. The Save Our Schools effort in the state is being was started and is being led by some folks in higher education, who I believe are AAUP members. So I think that's something to think about too. Just defending the value of public education at all levels is critical, and also can help to split some of the business people potentially away from this radicalized Republican Party. I know that's happening in North Carolina, and I know it's been happening in Wisconsin as well.
Yes, yeah, and your book even references that with some of Buchanan's more radical ideas, where he really started losing people because he took it just a step too far.
Yes.
One of the other questions we had from members was they were interested in hearing if you could maybe, if you have thoughts or specific thoughts about the agenda that the Koch brothers have for higher education in particular. You know, and obviously there's the centers they're funding, but sort of how that plays out maybe across the whole sector of higher education.
Yeah, I think there's maybe two parts to this. One part is their hostility to public education in any form, but also particularly public higher education. And I laid that out in chapter 7 of the book, which you guys actually published in Academe. So that's available for people, and it's a pretty short chapter, but it's involves James Buchanan's reaction to the campus protests of the 1960s, and
right.
Or, for example, full cost tuition, changing university governance, et cetera, as his perceived antidote to that. And that's really sort of the blueprint that the right has been following wherever they get control. But the other piece that you point to is what they're doing now through this network. And I'm sure folks who are listening and your members are aware that essentially it seems like this Koch network will try to destroy anything they can't control, right? So they are actively trying to turn people against higher education. They've now persuaded a majority of Republicans that higher education is a bad thing. This is just absolutely stunning, you know, in the 21st century. And they are also actively putting in their centers and implants on campuses. They now give funding in some form to over 300 campuses, I believe is the latest figure. People can find more out about that from Unkoch, my campus, the great group of young people fighting the Koch presence on campuses that I know you guys have worked with, and I know you're working with them also on a model donor policy to ensure transparency. And also I know that many higher education unions have said that, or locals have said that focusing on the Koch presence can be really helpful in between contracts, you know, when members kind of stop paying attention and you need to kind of galvanize them. And I think it's a great way to connect people's concerns about what's happening in American society and the crisis of our democracy more generally with their own campuses and local issues and state politics, to focus on those Koch centers. So I think that would be a great way of addressing things too.
Great, thank you so much. And you know, I just want to say one of the questions I had for you, and you're kind of weaving this into the conversation, was, you know, the practical steps that we need to take as educators and as members of higher education. You know, I'm really struck, and you mentioned earlier the Red for Ed movement that we've seen in Arizona, West Virginia, North Carolina. You know, I wonder if you have any further musings on practical steps that higher education faculty, or those, you know, graduate employees, contingent faculty, academic professionals, all of us sort of engaged in fulfilling the mission of higher education, steps that we can take to kind of build our own Red for Ed movement.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Well, one thing might be to begin with an awareness that the right has really followed a strategy focused on building power at the state level in order to affect the transformation that they have. And so they now dominate 30 state governments in the US. Hopefully that will change somewhat next week, but that's where we are now. And they're partly doing that because state governments are the easiest for corporations and this radical right to control. Most people pay attention to national politics or to local politics, but not to state politics. Only 20% of people on average pay attention to state politics, and that skews older, whiter, and wealthier. So obviously, for public higher education, that is where the action is. And so I think in terms of what we could be doing, helping our students, right, and our colleagues to understand the critical importance of what goes on at the state level is a good starting place. All the voting suppression measures are coming out from the state level. You know, the fight over Medicaid expansion is at the state level. Funding for education at all levels is there. So, so we could also think about, honestly, something like civic education, returning to that, maybe having teach-ins, you know, after the elections to get people to say, okay, what kind of agenda do we need to bring to our state legislatures? We haven't done a great job of that on the progressive side. And I'm hearing that. I've been speaking with groups like the National Network of Social Work Organizations, nurses, et cetera. And they're all saying, my gosh, we've really neglected teaching our students like how politics works, right? I mean, how you have to organize, what you need to do, what a legislative agenda is, what a precinct captain does. All this kind of work needs to be revived, I think, and done so in a way that would energize a new generation.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. And, you know, it's interesting to think about that in relationship to the waning of the teaching of civics as a, you know, a class that everybody takes when they're in junior high or high school. That's something that's really disappeared from the curriculum in a way, and it hasn't been replaced. But I really like the idea of teach-ins and sort of engaging and you know, taking really the skill set that higher education faculty have, which is teaching and taking ideas and sparking other people and you know, using that, being more public facing about how we do that and the kinds of things we choose to do that about.
I think that's great too, because it would also encourage face-to-face organizing, which we know is the best kind of organizing, right? And also just, you know, for young people and even folks of our own generations, you know, so many people now, the default is just to go and spout off on Facebook, but we need to remember that does nothing, right? It doesn't change anything. It doesn't get anybody out to the poll. I mean, it does something. I don't mean to be so dismissive, but I think, you know, organizing events, building community, you know, helping people to understand how they can make a difference at a time when so many people are so deeply concerned and also are really feeling troubled by isolation and feelings of hopelessness. And so I think organizing is important for that too, to get back that kind of esprit de corps, you know, to take whatever we have, whatever comes out of Tuesday, you know, and kind of push it to the next stage. Things like teach-ins would be great for that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. In the book, you talk quite a bit about the U.S. Constitution and I guess what I would call the friction points that are built into it, or I think you refer to them as veto points. And one of our members, I think, picked up on that, and he was wondering what you think of the Electoral College, and should we be moving to a model where the president is elected by popular vote?
Well, there is actually a national popular vote campaign that would be, you know, interesting for folks to look into. Essentially, it's a model that encourages states to pledge their electoral college votes to whomever wins the popular vote. It's less likely that that could go forward now because Republicans are losing the popular vote, you know, pretty consistently. So that might not work so well. But I'd say actually two things about the Constitution. One is that, yeah, as I lay out in that last chapter, our Constitution is already the one in the world that is most inhibiting of majority rule and achieving what even large numbers, you know, supermajorities want. So we have that challenge built in, but we also have a challenge coming from the right at this point, which is they are pushing for the first state-convened constitutional convention under Article 5 of the Constitution that we've ever had since that document was ratified. So this is an incredibly radical effort. It is moving forward. They have 28 of the 34 states needed, authorizations needed for this. So I'm actually going to be doing some writing about this, try to get some stuff out after the election as kind of a next step. But so that's something to have in mind, that I think we need to deal with this incredible threat from the right to make our already restrictive constitution worse. And then, having surmounted that threat, which we must do, then I think we should go on to think about the real challenges we face now, that we're essentially being ruled by a smaller and smaller minority in this country. You know, when you think about the basis of representation in the Senate, for example, you know, the Senate who opposed Brett Kavanaugh represented, I forget the exact numbers, but way more people than those who voted for him, right? But because of the geographical nature of representation, we were at a loss. And that's something that's going on, you know, in all different domains to pay attention to, is this problem of rule by a more conservative and white majority that doesn't really represent where the country is at this point.
Yeah, and that might be a good point for us to kind of segue to. Well, there's two things kind of left on my plate that I want to talk about, and I'm also cognizant of the time. I've been struck in the past year or so, and especially in the run up to this midterm, with the challenges to voting rights, or the limitations of voting rights, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see that playing into this larger agenda.
Yeah, voter suppression is absolutely, you know, at the center of, and kind of exhibit A of what I describe in the book, of this effort to put democracy in chains. Essentially, you have people who have an agenda that they understand the majority of the people don't want, and therefore it is critical for them to keep the people from participating in the political process. So that is really important. And actually, that could be a very important focus for campus-based, you know, as we were talking about civic education or teach-ins, going from this election next Tuesday into 2020, to particularly help students understand that the right is going for their voting rights too, right? The legally actionable voter suppression involves racial discrimination, not age discrimination, but the right is absolutely coming after young people and trying to make it harder for young people to vote. And I think as educators, we could do a lot to spread that message. And nobody likes to have things taken away from them, young people above all, right? So that could be a very, very cool focus, I think. By the way, one other tool that would be great for teach-ins and the like about public higher education is the documentary Starving the Beast. I'm not sure if you know about it, but I know that some colleges in North Carolina rather, have used it for public events to engage students and faculty and staff in the issues about what's being done to public higher education. So that could be, you know, one particular really useful tool. It's a very, very powerful documentary, and not just depressing. They show some good victories too. So I would recommend that.
Right, and I guess maybe to end on a high note, if we can. You referenced some of the victories that are referred to in Starving the Beast. I wonder if you want to talk about some victories you've seen recently, or places where you think maybe the tide is shifting and there's some indication that this agenda or this stranglehold is breaking a bit.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start with a quote that I've heard attributed to David Cole at the ACLU, but he says that Donald Trump is an alien sent from outer space to unify the American left. And there's a lot to that, because I've been traveling around the country for the last year, speaking to all kinds of audiences, you know, on campuses, you know, such different disciplinary hosts, but also unions, community groups, environmental groups, feminist groups, civil rights. And so many people are getting that we are at an all hands on deck emergency for democracy in this country. And people who are already in motion are thinking, okay, how do we have to walk differently? Who are the new partners we need to be with? As your first question pointed to, what's the kind of message that we should be carrying to turn the tide? But also so many new people who weren't paying attention to politics are actives, you know, the Parkland students and all the young people who have gotten involved in the March for Our Lives, the women of the, Women's March, and then the various local resistance groups, the Red for Ed teachers and the Save Our Schools movement. So I think there's a lot going on out there that we can connect to. And, it's the classic situation that moments of great crisis and threat also tend to be moments of amazing opportunity if we seize it, what we can do and what new people we can draw in.
I think that is a perfect place to end. I think that's the message we all need to be leaving this broadcast with, and especially going into next Tuesday. So thank you very much, Nancy, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
All right, great. Take care.
All right, thank you.
Good luck to everyone.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.